just happened by accident. As an historian at this event, I actually thought I was going to be out of place. I didn't think that anything I said was going to fit in. But on the contrary, a number of papers have been engaging with some of the themes that I'll be talking about. But I am still a little bit of an outlier. I'm going backwards rather than forwards. A lot of people rightly are concerned about global warming. I'm going to talk about the fear in my childhood, which was global cooling. Now, we've talked about philosophers and mathematicians at this conference. A famous one was Rene Descartes. Those of you who are familiar with his discourse on method may recall that Descartes begins by talking that he got the idea for writing about the discourses while sheltering from an unseasonable storm in a large oven-heated room, of which you can see an example there in the 17th century. Now, the oven-heated room is interesting. Why create such an oven to heat rooms unless there was a need for it? This might tell us something about the weather in the 17th century. There's another figure, but we don't know what he looks like, despite what you might find on the internet, who I'm going to also talk about briefly and conclude with. He's sometimes been called England's first communist. He's also been called England's first Green, although I've disputed that. And his name is Gerard Winstanley. Now, he recalls that when he wrote the preface to one of his collected works, that he was so filled up with the Holy Spirit that he wrote all night, despite the fact that his hands were freezing the entire time. He felt warmed by an inner divine power. It's not the warmth of the Holy Spirit I want you to think about, it's the fact he was writing with cold hands, along with Descartes writing in a cold climate. Now, why is the cold so important? Well, since the 1930s, 1939 to be exact, through the work of the Dutch-born glaciologist Francois Matthes, we now recognise that people during the early modern period were living in what is called a little ice age. This little ice age has been characterised, according to the studies that we have, by temperature drops of 1 to 1.5 degrees centigrade below modern averages in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, there's an associated question here which is perhaps sometimes overlooked. Today, we associate global warming with being a bad thing. In the pre-industrial world, warm and wet was good. We talk about a medieval global optimum where warm and wet climates were actually conducive to the development of human civilization, whereas dry and cold, which is the period I'm talking about, was catastrophic. So that's something to think about. Also, of course, good and bad are rather simplistic. You'll note that my paper includes a reference to The Global Crisis by Geoffrey Parker. The first thing I want to point out is that historians have been interested in the environment and latterly climate since at least the post-war period. The pioneers, of course, are the French Annales school. His name hasn't been mentioned yet, but Braudel's History of the Mediterranean in the Age of Philip II needs to be spoken about, as does Leroy-Laduree's talk of famine and feast. Long history, more lately in the English-speaking world, Keith Thomas, German-speaking world, Wolfgang Behringer's Cultural History of Climate, that grew out of his history, interest in the history of the persecution of witches. Other works there, Brian Fagan's The Little Ice Age, various journals now associated and directed towards climate change. So historians are certainly interested in it. Why is the question. What is Parker's argument and why is it relevant today? Well, in an earlier discussion, we were talking about the fact that historians, they write in the present, and many of their concerns about the past are moulded by present-day issues. So with the rise of the HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, there was an historical turn towards medical history and an interest in disease. Similarly, historians are now interested in climate and environment because what the past might tell us might be revealing about strategies to cope with the future. Confining myself to the Northern Hemisphere, the 17th century is marked by some of the following. Wars in North America between settlers from England and France and some of the native tribes. There is rebellion in Ireland. We have people based in Ireland here today, so I don't need to talk too much about Cromwell and what happened at Drogheda. There's rebellion in Scotland. the civil war in England, and a revolution, I would argue. In France, you have its own variant, the Fronde. In Iberia, you have a revolt in Portugal, you have a revolt in Catalonia. In the German-speaking areas, you have a 30 Years' War. In Naples, you have the revolt of Masaniello. In Russia, you have the Time of Troubles. In the Ottoman Empire, you have Palace Coup. In Mughal India, you have civil war. In China, you have civil war and a transition from a Ming to a Qing dynasty. Some contemporaries estimated, and I'm sure they exaggerated, that a third of the world's population died in the 17th century as a result of various catastrophes: plague, natural disasters, war. Undoubtedly, huge amounts did die. In England, for example, which I know most about, 80,000 soldiers killed or maimed during the civil wars, a higher percentage of the population than any moment until the First World War. The death toll in Europe certainly is the highest percentage of death toll as a percentage of population at any time in recorded human history before the 20th century. Those are facts. We may argue slightly about the numbers, but those are the facts. So the question is, can we connect these events in any way, shape, or form, or they just happen to be separate incidents that occur at the same century? Parker's attempt is called a general crisis. Well, the original thesis was a general crisis related to Northern Europe. As you can now see from the title of the book, it's a global crisis. It suggests that there is a causal linkage between them. One of his suggestions is that this catastrophic century is set against a backdrop of the Little Ice Age. That the Little Ice Age is one of the things that produces the conditions for all the conflict that I've been describing. Now, we've heard papers in which have been suggested that in the future, if climate change continues unchecked, we will be squabbling and fighting amongst each other for resources. We will be competing. And there are catastrophic visions and narratives of one of those possible futures. Personally, I'm not yet convinced that climate explains all of these events. It can certainly explain, as I'm going to suggest, some events. But as Leroy-Ladurie suggested, nobody in their right mind would argue that the weather caused the Fronde in France. Nobody would argue that the weather caused the English Civil War. But the weather most certainly led to terrible famines, to terrible harvest failure, to massive social pressures, and to demands for social justice and to ways of dealing with it. So it's part of the story. But we shouldn't look at it as a uniform explanation for everything. Now, I'm going the wrong way. How do we think about the period? Parker has rightly suggested that we need to think about two types of source material to talk about these things, what he called the natural and the human archive. What he called the natural archive is something you'll be familiar with. It's how scientists reconstruct past climate and weather. So ice core samples, for example, tree ring data, all this sorts of material. I'll leave that to the professional scientists. The natural archive is extensive, and if historians wanted to work on the weather, they would find far more material than they are usually aware of. We have, for example, chronicles at national and local level, local government records, diaries, letters, contemporary news books, printed proclamations, pamphlets, scientific and astrological treatises, visual representations. All of these are source materials for the weather. For example, in England, people in agricultural communities often kept diaries about the weather. I've given you two examples there, one from Suffolk, one from Norfolk. As world-shattering events were taking place, they were recording the weather. There's more information about the weather in 1648 and 1649 in the diary of John Clopson than there is about the English Civil War and the execution of Charles I. That doesn't mean to say that they're disinterested, but events in London are quite far away from the Essex-Suffolk border. Concerns with the weather also are illustrated in one of my favourite painters, Archambault. Why draw a portrait of the Emperor Rudolph II as the Roman god of fertility unless there is a crisis of resources? Perhaps this is an indication that you actually want the Earth to be more bountiful because you're dealing with extremes in winter in particular. Or I mentioned an entire genre of painting. You'll all have seen some of these, maybe not these particular images. Dutch landscape pictures, winter landscapes. Why would you have a genre of winter landscapes unless it was an every year occurrence? So here we have Averkamp again. Whoops, help. I've pressed the wrong button, have I? I was doing so well. Perfect, thank you, yeah. Most famously, of course, Bruegel. Okay, you can all see that, yeah, that's perfect, yeah. Bruegel. Now, there are some points that I want to make. This doesn't give us an accurate representation of what the weather was. It's a painting. It may be an accurate representation, but we can't necessarily be certain. I'm being very conscious now of the buttons I'm pressing. Scientific instrumentation is also developing in this period, but it doesn't have the same level of precision that our modern instrumentation does. So when we rely on 17th century recordings of the weather, they're approximations in relation to what we're used to, so they have to be used with a caveat. Not until Mr. Fahrenheit, Daniel Gabriel, and Mr. Celsius do we have accurate ways of measuring temperature, but this is later. Another point I want to make, people who record the weather in their diaries continuously, there's an Essex minister called Ralph Jocelyn who lived at Earl's Colne. He would wake up in the morning and he would say, it's cold, it's sunny, it's fair, for 25 years. Now, at the end of 25 years, when he says it's cold, is that it's still cold in relation to what it was 25 years ago? Is it cold because he's now an old man and he feels the cold? So my point is that we can use these for what is extreme in relation to normative experience at a particular moment, which is why the title of my work is Extreme Weather Events rather than the weather and climate. We can know what is extreme in relation to what is normative, but we can't necessarily document it with precision. Now, why are contemporaries so concerned about the weather with the immediate rather than the long-term climate? Well, that's easy. Trade is utterly dependent upon the weather. Communications networks, utterly dependent upon the weather. Military campaigns. You can't march an army if you haven't got any food resources. Although the Swedes will march across frozen, they will march all the way from Sweden into Denmark when that strait freezes over. The Turks march across frozen Romanian rivers, and they march artillery across the Bosphorus. It gives you an idea how cold it was. But most importantly, of course, agriculture. In a pre-industrial subsistence economy, the weather is crucial for this. It's also been suggested by some historians, but I'm not really sure whether this is true or not, that contemporaries suffered from seasonal affective disorder. That because they were deprived of sunlight in this extreme cold, that they got depressed. Certainly, we have a language of melancholia. So it's possible the weather may have caused this. A final point I want to talk about is that our resources for thinking about the weather is far larger than we've grown to appreciate. We've got literary scholars in the audience. One of the things we need to think about is the way that literature talks about the seasons, not just as metaphor, but perhaps also as evidence. The way that the weather is an aside. If you read the sources against the grain, you'll find more information. Now, how did contemporaries think about the weather? What resources did they have? And here we have some nice tie-ins with some of the other papers we've been hearing. The Near East, of course, has a profusion of deities associated with the weather, storm gods and the like, some of which became incorporated into Old Testament visions of the Jewish god Yahweh. The Bible has an abundance of extreme weather events, most notably, of course, the Great Flood, which in modern language would be a mass extinction event. But also, of course, the plagues of Egypt and various storms on the Sea of Galilee. So there is an actual cultural resource in which to think about the weather. I want to make a further point that has never been made, and to suggest this. In Catholic Europe, there are no vernacular translations of the Bible in this period, neither in Spain nor in Italy. But with the advent of printing and the vernacular translations into English, into French, into German, for example, that contemporaries are being given a new resource to think about the weather because they have a greater vocabulary because of the vernacular translations of the Bible. So they have far larger linguistic repertoire to think about the weather than they have had before because they're accessing the Bible. So that's something to also think about, and maybe one of the reasons they're interested in it. Besides the Bible, of course, I should add, there is a whole range of classical sources that talk about extreme weather events. Now, to supplement the classical and the biblical, there is, of course, personal experience. And if you look at contemporary pamphlets, I only know the English evidence, so I've picked a few for you. Contemporaries are very concerned with the weather. They document, for example, thunder, hail, lightning, flood, storm, and there's huge amounts of records of evidence. I've just put a few here to illustrate the point. I like this. I haven't got a pointer with me, but if you look up in the clouds in the sky, you can see a very, very crudely drawn thunder deity with thunderbolts to give you an idea of how contemporaries are visualizing. Or here in a very popular format, the ballad, again, how contemporaries are illustrating. So cold did it become that the River Thames used to freeze over on several occasions, not to mention the Rhine and elsewhere. But this forms one of the motifs of my talk, that the weather isn't always about catastrophe. It's also about adaptation and opportunity. It doesn't have to lead to one outcome rather than another. The Great Frost, when the Thames froze over, meant an opportunity for shopping without having to pay rent on your property. You could open up a booth on the River Thames, nobody could charge you, invite people out and hold a fair, which is what they did here, as you can see. This is the earliest known example of a frost fair in, I think it's 1608, I can't remember the exact example, and one in 1683. Another particular favourite here where they are actually playing football, if you can spot it. Yeah, you can probably see it in the right hand towards the bottom bit. Or they document the growth of glaciers. Now, I realise I've only got 5 minutes left. Coupled with the weather, there are natural disasters. And in a trailer for another conference that's going to be held at Sen-Sam, natural disasters are configured as apocalyptic events, naturally so because earthquakes and the like are mentioned in the book of Revelation. So, for example, Mount Vesuvius explodes, killing more than 25,000 Neapolitans in December 1631. That's relevant because it's been proven that in conjunction with reduced sunspot activity, the ash, so to link to, where is it, another paper, and the dust that goes into the atmosphere again reduces temperature. Now, how did contemporaries explain this? Well, that's easy, and this links into yet more papers. God. Everything is divine, the will of divine providence, whether you're Protestant or whether you're Catholic. Now, why is God angry? The answer is again obvious, and we need to think also here about present-day concerns with eco-sins. God is angry with the sins of contemporaries. What type of sins? Heresy, blasphemy, sexual misdemeanors, luxurious living, vanity, ostentatious display, pride, greed, political action or inaction, regicide. These are the type of sins that contemporaries believed they were being punished for with extreme weather events. The template is the Bible. And who did they blame? Well, not themselves, of course. They would have national days of fasting and penance in which they made suitable penance. But the main victims, the outsiders, the scapegoats, were the same as they had been in the Middle Ages, more or less. Jews, heretics, lepers, supposed witches, prostitutes. The usual people in the modern language you might want to use of the other. These are the people who got the blame. Now, I want to make a final point. It doesn't have to lead to crisis and catastrophe. One of the solutions that contemporaries had was adaptation. They adapted to extreme weather events. How? Well, for example, in changing in fashion. You only have to look at early modern 16th century paintings to see the amount of fur that is used. Adaptations of hairstyle, adaptations of clothing, adaptations in architecture, using more glass to let in more sunlight because there's less sunlight, stockpiling of provisions to deal with famine and medical emergencies when possible, even attempted predicting the weather. I don't mean people praying to God and saying God has given me a sign that it will rain in 20 days' time. I mean advanced scientific calculations that lead to the basis of calculating when lunar and solar eclipses are going to be. And we have, it's no coincidence, during this period, a scientific revolution. Is that one of the spurs for this climate? A further point, in medicine, alchemy, producing universal medicines, panaceas, etc. So global weather can lead to catastrophe, but it can also lead to creative solutions. And I'm conscious I have to conclude, so I'm going to conclude with the person that I began with, namely Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers. In England, in the winters of 1647, 1648, they're two of the harshest and most terrible winters that were recorded in the early modern period. They led to famine, to death of animals, to disease. The Diggers did not try and topple the government. They organised collectively as a community. They took control of the common land and a hill in Surrey, which is now a golf course, and they tilled the land and they shared the produce until the local gentry united with the clergy because they realised that what they were doing was threatening and challenging their power. They whipped up the local people who dressed up as women and booted them off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariel. Questions for Ariel?
Thanks very much for that wonderful conspectus. Now, I know you were speaking about extreme weather events.
Yeah.
But generally, it is part of a species of explanation that is a climatic explanation. I know you distinguish between weather and climate. Just let me use climate for the sake of this. But what I'm wondering here is, are climatic explanations the same as climate change explanations? Now, I say this because the cold could have done certain things, but maybe only because it was colder than they'd had before. Had it been warmer, it would have done certain things. So, in fact, is it the climate that's driving it, or just that it's a different climate from what they'd previously been used to?
I think I understand the distinction, but in a sense, because it's different from what they've been used to, they're having to adapt to it because it's different. But also, in the Northern Hemisphere, it makes a significant difference to when you can harvest your crops, to whether your crops will survive, if there's less rain, if the frost is coming later, and is starting earlier and finishing later. You're reducing the food resources. There's a wonderful discussion of how many calories a human being needs to survive. If you reduce the growing season and you have fewer crops, then you use the crops that you do harvest to feed yourself and your family first, and then you don't sell the surplus. So it leads to a famine because you don't have that surplus to sell. So those in the urban areas are going to be more grievously affected because if local governments and state authorities can't adapt through, for example, provisioning, or because people are speculating and actually want to profit from a rise in price in grain. So, in answer to your question, it is extremely markedly, I mean, one of the things I didn't get to talk about was the so-called medieval warm period. Not only is it much colder on average than it is today, it's significantly colder than it was. I mean, I didn't know this, but in comparison to pre-Black Death medieval period is a bucolic period in comparison to the 17th century. The population is larger, crops are more fertile. You can grow wine in England. I mean, I know that people have attempted that today, and I know this is being recorded, but apparently it was drinkable. But that gives you an idea of the variation and changes. But it's a fair point. Are they responding to something that's unusual in their life experience or in relation to what's normative? But it's extreme in relation certainly to what was 300 years ago. Yeah.
Do you not think that your sort of Eurocentric sort of argument about how climate change could bring about sort of more creative sort of solutions be a bit reductive? Because in places like Pakistan, they're experiencing temperatures of like 55 degrees, which is obviously at a point in which humans just can't survive. So I'm just thinking, do you think your argument could fuel, I don't know, a sort of basis in which that it doesn't help the debate of climate change in the fact that it's unevenly felt, which is obviously earlier discussed? So I don't know, I get your argument in your paper, but I think it could be also damaging. I don't know.
Sure.
You understand?
Yeah, I understand perfectly your point. As I say, I'm a historian, so my concern is with the past. And I think that just trying to explain climate as a harbinger of crisis is not the only way to think about climate in the early modern period. I said that those who want to take what I talk about the early modern period in relation to the present and the future can. Those who just want to think that I'm debating Parker and how to understand, which is how I see it, and that's fine. And don't forget also, what I'm talking about is 1 to 1.5 degrees colder than it is in relation to now. I'm not talking hotter, which is a different situation. I don't want to get into conversations about whether or not there is only one pathway that we have at present into the future. I'm just making the observation that in the past, a particular extreme set of weather events did lead to different types of pathways. Now, that may mean that there are different pathways now, or that there may only be one pathway. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I don't get into that. But in the past, if we want to learn from the past, we know that there is more than one way. That's all I'm going to say.
Any other questions for Ariel? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.